Starting at number 10, we have the sixth cholera plague pandemic. That was from the years 1910 and 1911. That had a death toll of over 800,000. Now, the sixth cholera plague originated in India, where over 800,000 people lost their lives before it spread to the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, and even Russia. And this sixth cholera pandemic was also the source of the last American outbreak of cholera back in the year 1910 to 1911. By the year 1923, cholera cases had been cut down drastically, although it was still a constant thing over in India. Number 9 brings us to the flu pandemic of the year 1968 with a death toll of 1 million. There was a Category 2 flu pandemic, sometimes referred to as the Hong Kong flu. This 1968 flu pandemic was caused by the H3N2 strain of the influenza A virus. Now, from the first reported case on July 13th, 1968, over in Hong Kong, within 3 months, this thing spread to the Philippines, India, Australia, Europe, and even the United States. Now, while the 1968 pandemic had a low mortality rate at about 0.5%, it still resulted in 500,000 residents of Hong Kong losing their lives, which was approximately 15% of the entire population of Hong Kong at that time. Now, next up we have the flu pandemic of the year 1889 to 1890 with a death toll of 1 million. So originally the Asiatic flu, or the Russian flu as it was called, was thought to be an outbreak of the influenza A virus subtype H2N2. But recent discoveries showed that it was actually the influenza A virus subtype H3N8. Now, the first cases were observed in May 1889 in 3 separate distant locations: in Pokhara in Central Asia, Athabasca in Canada, and also over in Greenland. Now, the rapid population growth of the 19th century, specifically in the urban areas, really just helped to spread the flu, and before long the outbreak had spread across the globe, becoming a pandemic. Number 7, we have the third cholera pandemic between the years 1852 and 1860. Their death toll was also 1 million. Considered to be the most deadly of the 7 cholera pandemics, like the first and second pandemics, the third cholera pandemic originated over in India, and it spread through Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. Now, there's a British physician by the name of Jon Snow, no relation to the character from Game of Thrones, but he tracked down cases of cholera, and he eventually succeeded in discovering that, hey, contaminated water was actually the means of how this was being transmitted. The Asian flu comes in next at number 6 between the years 1956 to 1958. Its death toll was 2 million. Now, the Asian flu was a pandemic outbreak of the influenza A H2N2 subtype that originated in China. Now, the Asian flu traveled from China to Singapore and the United States, and estimates for the loss of life total of the Asian flu by the World Health Organization is approximately 2 million, and 69,800 of those were in the US. Halfway in at number 5, we have the Antonine Plague at 165 AD with a death toll of 5 million. Also known as the Plague of Galen, the Antonine Plague was a pandemic that affected Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, and Italy, and it's thought to have been either smallpox or the measles, but the true cause of this is actually still unknown. They have no idea what this was. So this unknown disease was brought back to Rome by soldiers returning from Mesopotamia around 165 AD unknowingly, and they had spread this disease across the land, which decimated the Roman army. The Plague of Justinian comes in at number 4 between the years 541 and 542. It had a death toll of 25 million. Now, this is said to possibly have eliminated half of the population of Europe at the time, and the Plague of Justinian was an outbreak of the bubonic plague, and the bubonic plague is caused by a bacterium named Yersinia pestis, and this afflicted the Byzantine Empire as well as parts of the Mediterranean, and at its height, 5,000 people per day were losing their lives. Now, number 3, we have the flu pandemic. We've seen the flu on this list several times. This is on the year 1918 and had an estimated 20 million to 50 million people that lost their lives. So between the years 1918 and 1920, there was a destructive outbreak of the influenza that went global. of the 500,000 people infected in the year 1918, the mortality rate was at 10% and it rose to 20%. What separated the 1918 flu pandemic from other influenza outbreaks, though, was that the victims themselves were different. It had started taking the lives of healthy young adults while leaving children and those with weaker immune systems completely fine. They weren't the ones passing away. HIV/AIDS comes in at number 2 with a death toll of 36 million, and I'm more so speaking of its peak in the year 2005 to 2012. Now, it was first identified in the Democratic Republic of Congo back in the year 1976, and currently there are between 31 and 35 million people living with AIDS right now, and the vast majority of those live in sub-Saharan Africa, where about 5% of the population is infected, and that's roughly 21 million people. Now, as awareness, of course, has grown a lot and new treatments have come out, so now HIV is a lot more manageable than it used to be, and many of those infected still go on to live very productive and prosperous lives. And finally, at number 1, we have the Black Death between the years 1346 and 1353. The death total was between 75 million and 200 million. So between these years of 1346 to 1353, there was an outbreak of this plague that completely ravaged Europe, Africa, and Asia. It was believed to be originated over in Asia though, and the plague most likely jumped continents through the fleas that were living on rats that were often found on merchant ships. So of course, ports were major urban centers at the time, so the bacteria among the rats and the fleas, they spread like wildfire.
Starting off with number 5, counting down to number 1, we have the Great Fire of 1919, 5 million acres, Canada. Fires in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada had burnt up 5 million acres of land. The wood that had been used for the timber industry contributed to the quick burning flames. These fires caused hundreds of people to lose their homes, as well as 11 people had passed away because of these flames. Because of the widespread boreal forest, scientists have pointed out that this area is very prone to wildfires. At number 4, we have the 1939 Black Friday bushfire, 5 million acres, Australia. These bushfires started because of a drought in Victoria, Australia on January 13th, 1939, a very unlucky Friday the 13th. Around 5 million acres were burnt up and 71 people had lost their lives. Over 1,300 homes and 69 sawmills were completely destroyed because of these flames, and 3,700 buildings were also destroyed. Calculations show that 3/4 of the state of Victoria was directly or indirectly affected by the fire. We journey into Canada again at number 3 for the 1989 Manitoba wildfires, 8.1 million acres. In 1989, the Canadian province of Manitoba was hit with wildfires that spread over 8 million acres. The flames from over 1,000 separate fires caused thousands of people to evacuate their homes all across the province. And the fires were started by a combination of extreme drought as well as human activity. God bless the country of Canada. Canada comes in again at number 2 in the 2014 Northwest Territory fires, 8.4 million acres. This is the most recent major wildfire on this list. In 2014, a terrible fire tore through the forests of the Northwest Territories, which is a massive territory in the northern part of Canada. These fires that burned up an area of over 8.4 million acres were a result of 130 separate fires that had broken out in the area. The smoke reached as far as Bismarck, North Dakota, which is over 2,000 kilometers, about 1,200 miles south. Some of the smoke had also even reached as far as Western Europe. But the biggest wildfire by far takes us into the country of Russia. In the year 2003, we have the Siberian taiga fires, 47 million acres. When you take a look at the satellite images, you can see that Eurasia is covered in smoke. Smoke plumes from the fires had covered the skies of Osaka, Japan, which was approximately 3,000 miles away, as well as soot from the fires were reported to reach as far as Seattle, Washington. Although we can't pinpoint the exact source of the fires, it's believed that these fires were set, whether accidental or intentional, we don't know, by illegal timber firms, and these illegal firms are known to sell cheap lumber to China. At number 10, we have Hurricane Yolanda. This happened in the year 2013, and it was a Category 5 super typhoon, and its diameter was 800 kilometers. Yolanda, also known as Typhoon Haiyan, is the smallest in this episode, but it's one of the strongest storms ever. Over 6,000 fatalities and $2 billion in damages happened in the Philippines. Yolanda also affected other nations like South China and Vietnam. Next up is Typhoon Usagi, also in 2013, and it was a Category 4 super typhoon. It had a diameter of 1,110 kilometers. Another storm off the coast of the Philippines in early September of 2013, the storm formed a 17-mile wide eye in 3 days and upgraded to a Category 5 hurricane. The storm caused $4.3 billion in total across the Philippines and China, with thousands of people made homeless and billions of dollars worth of crops that were destroyed. Typhoon Marakwet comes in at number 8, formed in 2009, and this was a Category 1 typhoon, and it had a diameter of 1,200 kilometers. Marakwet was one of the biggest to hit Taiwan. Its 90-mile-per-hour wind speed may not seem that dangerous, but it moved very slowly, which had it cause a lot of damage. Over 100 feet of rain fell, causing massive flooding, and the storm also affected other Southeast Asian countries, including China and Japan. Total, Marakwet costs over $6 billion in damage. The year 2014 brought us Hurricane Karl, and this was a Category 3 major hurricane. It had a diameter of 1,255 kilometers. Karl is the 6th largest Atlantic hurricane ever formed off the coast of Cape Verde. Luckily, it weakened to a Category 1 before ending off in the Faroe Islands, and no damages were recorded. Just 3 years ago, we saw Hurricane Nicole in 2016, and this was a Category 4 major hurricane with a diameter of 1,285 kilometers. Nicole was only in Bermuda, where it caused a lot of damage, yet it still affected other areas. In the United States, there were some huge waves that were created by the storm that affected beaches in South Florida. Back in the year 1996, we had Hurricane Lily, and this was a Category 3 major hurricane. The storm had a diameter of 1,345 kilometers. Beginning as a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico and ending after hitting London, this massive slow-moving storm was responsible for a lot of flooding and damages in 2 continents. The countries of Cuba and Bahamas suffered quite a bit of fatalities. Coming in at number 4, we have Hurricane Igor. This Category 4 hurricane was formed in 2010 and had a diameter of 1,335 kilometers. Fortunately for the people of the Caribbean and the United States, Igor weakened to a Category 3 as it approached. It barely caused any damage in Bermuda. Newfoundland and Canada, however, got hit the hardest. Nearly $200 million in damages was caused by Igor. At number 3, we have Hurricane Sandy. Back in the year 2012, this one caused a lot of destruction. It was a Category 3 hurricane with a diameter of 1,380 kilometers. Sandy is the 3rd most devastating hurricane to ever hit the United States. Damages cost $70 billion. Sandy hit the Caribbean and traveled to the east coast of the United States, and in total, 24 states were affected. The second biggest hurricane is Hurricane Olga, formed in 2001, and this was a Category 1 hurricane with a diameter of 1,595 kilometers. Olga is the largest Atlantic hurricane when you go by its diameter. However, it was not a strong storm at all, and great thing about this was that it didn't cause any damages whatsoever and nobody was injured. The number 1 biggest hurricane was Typhoon Tip, formed in 1979. This was a Category 5 super typhoon with a diameter of 2,220 kilometers. Typhoon Tip is the largest by diameter in history. Tip formed over the Marshall Islands near the Philippines, and it gained strength as it moved over the ocean, eventually becoming a Category 5. It also caused damage to Japan. Boats and people at sea sank, and tens of thousands of people were left homeless because of the flooding.
USS Pickering, and it was the first ship to really go missing in the Bermuda Triangle. Now, there are some kind of rumors that some ships have done it before, but this is the most well-documented ship. Now, it was a topsail schooner named after Timothy Pickering, who was the head of state. Now, on August 20th of 1880, it was supposed to go to the West Indies, where it was going to become part of Thomas Truxton's squadron. Now, the last time she was seen was on August 20th when she left Newcastle, Delaware. And after that, the ship disappeared. disappeared. There are many theories, but most believe that it was sunk in a gale in September with 90 people aboard. Because also at that same time, the USS Insurgent sunk because of the storm. Now, okay, we are talking about, well, incidents and accidents that happened in the Bermuda Triangle, but I'm quite curious of where the Bermuda Triangle got its name. This goes back to 1964 from an article written by Vincent H. Gaddis for the Argosy magazine. Now, in the magazine, he had a general idea of where each point of the triangle was. However, scientists and other theorists have said, well, it's in different locations. But as for the United States Board of Geographical Names, they don't recognize any of these points, and nor do they recognize the Bermuda Triangle itself. Now, for this next one, let's talk about the biggest disaster to ever happen at sea in the Bermuda Triangle. And that was of the USS Cyclops. This one was big. Now, it was a Proteus-class collier, and the story goes that on March 4th, 1918, the ship had lost engine power. And after that, the ship went down, and what makes this accident infamous is that 306 men were on board when she sunk. As a matter of fact, it was so infamous that the US Navy has titled it as the worst loss of life without combat reasons. Now, there are many different theories to suggest why the ship went down, one of the most popular being the fact that a central I-beam became eroded and practically snapped the ship in two. Now, let's talk about the Carroll A. Deering. This was another schooner ship. Now, she was carrying cargo on January 28th, 1921, and she was seen by the Cape Lookout lightship, and they had noticed that the crew was kind of milling about in areas that they shouldn't have, and the ship had received some damage from a storm. However, a few days later, the ship was found at the Diamond Shoals on January 31st. But this time, the ship was completely empty. Theories suggest that there might have been pirates that came and took over the ship. Others suggest that maybe a mutiny took place. Now, you know what? Next one, let's jump back to the USS Cyclops. You know, the one that we just talked about like 1 second ago? Now, remember how I told you she was a Proteus-class ship? Well, she wasn't the only ship of her class to go missing in the Bermuda Triangle. As a matter of fact, her sister ship, the USS Proteus, was lost off the coast of St. Thomas with 58 people on board. And that was on November 23rd of 1941. But a month later, another sister ship to the Cyclops, the Nereus, was also lost. And that makes 3 out of 4 of the same class ship lost, and probably due to the I-beam problem. Now, here is one that is so infamous you probably already know about it. We're talking about Flight 19. This was a squadron of Avengers that went missing on December 5th, 1945. Now, these guys were just doing a training exercise. They just went out into the sea and then they never came back. And that means 14 guys were gone missing. But what's creepy is not only did those planes go missing, but part of the rescue team went missing as well. They sent out 2 Martin PBM Mariner flying boats, and one of them never came back with 13 men aboard. Man, that is just weirdly creepy. I mean, sister ships going down and the rescue team going down as well. It's like, what is the Bermuda Triangle? Now, here's an interesting one. The USS Scorpion was a skipjack nuclear submarine. Yeah, I'm pretty sure hearing about a nuclear submarine going down to Bermuda is not a good thing. Now, in May 21st of 1968, she was last reported about 50 miles south of Azores. But about 6 days later, she was presumed overdue. Now, after a big search, the Navy presumed her as lost and took her off the Navy list. However, she was found in October with her hull being split in two. Now, there's many different theories about how she went down. Some people think that, well, she got struck by a Soviet torpedo and went down. But some experts are saying, no, she went down because of accidental explosion when they were testing a torpedo. Now, the L. Austin, this is a very weird story. Another schooner that during her voyage of 1881, the crew noticed another ship with no crew aboard. What's with all these ships with no crew aboard in Bermuda? However, the captain of the L. Austin decided to split her crew in half and sail both ships back to New York. However, because of a storm, the 2 ships were separated and the unknown ship was never seen again except for one time. The L. Austin did reach New York on February 11th of 1881, which was an exceptionally long journey for her, which most of the time was taken up looking for the other ship. The Sulphur Queen. Now, this T2 tanker, she was converted in 1960 to carry molten sulfur. Now, she disappeared February 4th, 1963, somewhere south of the Florida Straits. Now, she had 39 crew aboard, and the US Coast Guard determined that the ship should have never sailed due to terrible maintenance. Now, last but not least, we gotta take one of the most recent actions accidents. The SSL Faro has been the worst accident in 33 years. Despite the fact that we even have all this modern technology and GPS, they just don't know what happened. Now on October 1st of 2015, the SSL Faro lost engine power and was taking on water. Now the captain did radio out saying that they did contain the flooding, but however her emergency beacon was activated shortly after and the ship was never heard of again. Now although like I said they contained the flooding, it was her engines that determined the fate of the ship. Because at that time Hurricane Joaquin had turned into a Category 3 hurricane, and that thing was just heading her way. Eventually the whole ship lost contact around 7:30 a.m. and about a month later they did find her wreck 15,000 feet below of where her last position was. And she was hiding in a very dark spot of the ocean. Now, although there's tons of cargo laying about, there has been no trace of the crew.
So at number 10 is the Antonine Plague with a death toll of 5 million people. Also known as the Plague of Galen, the Antonine Plague was an ancient pandemic that affected Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, and Italy, and is thought to have been either smallpox or measles, though the true cause is still unknown. This unknown disease was brought back to Rome by soldiers returning from Mesopotamia around 165 AD. Unknowingly, they had spread a disease that would end up killing over 5 million people and decimating the Roman army. Next up on the list is the Black Death with an estimated death toll of 75 to 200 million people. Thought to have originated in Asia, the plague most likely jumped continents via the fleas living on the rats that so frequently lived aboard merchant ships. Ports being major urban centers at the time were the perfect breeding ground for the rats and fleas, and thus the insidious bacterium flourished, devastating 3 continents in its wake. At number 8 is the third cholera pandemic, which was the third major outbreak of cholera originating in India in the 19th century that reached far beyond its borders, which researchers at UCLA believe may have started as early as 1837 and lasted until 1863. In Russia, more than 1 million people died of cholera. In 1853, the epidemic in London claimed over 10,000 lives, and there were 23,000 deaths for all of Great Britain. British physician John Snow, while working in a poor area of London, tracked causes of cholera and eventually succeeded in identifying contaminated water as the means of transmission for the disease. Nonetheless, this disease was considered to have the highest fatalities of the 19th century epidemics. Next up on the list is the flu pandemic. Originally known as the Asiatic flu or Russian flu as it was called, the strain was thought to be an outbreak of the influenza A virus subtype H2N2, though recent discoveries have instead found the cause to be the influenza A virus subtype H3N8. The first cases were observed in May 1889 in 3 separate and distant locations: Bukhara in Central Asia, Athabasca in northwestern Canada, and Greenland. Rapid population growth of the 19th century, specifically in urban areas, only helped the flu spread, and before long, the outbreak had spread across the entire globe. Though it was the first true epidemic in the era of bacteriology and much was learned from it. In the end, the 1889-1890 flu pandemic claimed the lives of over 1 million individuals. At number 6 is ironically the 6th cholera pandemic. Like its 5th previous incarnations, the 6th cholera pandemic originated in India where it killed over 800,000 people before spreading to the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, and Russia. The 6th cholera pandemic was also the source of the last American outbreak of cholera. American health authorities, having learned from the past, quickly sought to isolate the infected, and in the end, only 11 deaths occurred in the US. By 1923, cholera cases had been cut down dramatically, although it was still a constant in India. Another very deadly pandemic humans had to undergo in historical times is the Plague of Justinian. Thought to have killed perhaps half the population of Europe, the Plague of Justinian was an outbreak of the bubonic plague that afflicted the Byzantine Empire and Mediterranean port cities, killing up to 25 million people in its year-long reign of terror. Generally regarded as the first recorded incident of the bubonic plague, the Plague of Justinian left its mark on the world, killing up to 1/4 of the population of the Eastern Mediterranean and devastating the city of Constantinople, where at its height it was killing an estimated 5,000 people per day, and eventually resulting in the deaths of 40% of the city's population. Next up on the list is the Spanish flu, which was an unusually deadly influenza pandemic, the first of the 2 pandemics involving H1N1 influenza virus. It infected 500 million people around the world, including people on remote Pacific islands and in the Arctic. Probably 50 million and possibly as high as 100 million died, making it one of the deadliest epidemics in human history. Some analyses have shown the virus to be particularly deadly because it triggers a cytokine storm, which ravages the stronger immune system of young adults. In contrast, a 2007 analysis of medical journals from the period of the pandemic found that the viral infection was no more aggressive than previous influenza strains. Instead, malnourishment, overcrowded medical camps and hospitals, and poor hygiene promoted bacterial superinfection. So at number 3 is SARS, otherwise known as a severe acute respiratory syndrome. Though the death toll wasn't nearly as high as the other pandemics I've listed above, this very recent syndrome did create a public scare and even caused the World Health Organization to issue a global alert. Between November 2002 and July 2003, an outbreak of SARS in southern China caused an eventual 8,098 cases, resulting in 774 deaths reported in 17 different countries, with the majority of cases in China mainland and Hong Kong. No cases of SARS have been reported worldwide since 2004. In late 2017, Chinese scientists traced the virus through the intermediary of civets to cave-dwelling horseshoe bats in Yunnan province. Though thankfully controlled, this virus may have potentially killed many more humans. On the same note of recent viruses, Ebola virus disease, simply known as Ebola, was another disease that once called for a public emergency to be announced. Ebola is a viral fever of humans and other primates caused by Ebola viruses. Signs and symptoms typically start between 2 days and 3 weeks after contracting the virus, with a fever, sore throat, muscular pain, and headaches. Vomiting, diarrhea, and rash usually follow, along with the decreased function of the liver and kidneys. During this time, some people also begin to bleed both internally and externally, and the disease has a high risk of death, killing 25% to 90% of those infected. Between 1976 and 2013, the World Health Organization reported 24 outbreaks involving 2,387 cases with 1,590 deaths. The largest outbreak to date was the epidemic in West Africa, which occurred from December 2013 to January 2016, with 28,646 cases and 11,323 deaths. It was declared no longer an emergency on March 29, 2016. The last disease that I'm going to mention in this video is HIV. First identified in Democratic Republic of the Congo in 1976, HIV has truly proven itself as a global pandemic, killing more than 36 million people since 1981. Currently, there are between 31 and 35 million people living with HIV. The vast majority of those are in sub-Saharan Africa, where 5% of the population is infected, roughly 21 million people. As awareness has grown, new treatments have been developed that make HIV far more manageable, and many of those infected go on to lead productive lives. Between 2005 and 2012, the annual global deaths from HIV dropped from 2.2 million to 1.6 million.